Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to IPDay's Tech Tuesdays. My name is Alex Ramirez, and I'll be your presenter this afternoon for our Tech Tuesday on using Microsoft Excel pivot tables to enhance data visualization. Before we get started, I do want to cover some quick house rules. During the presentation, if you have any questions at any time, please type them into the Q&A option. At the end of the presentation, I'll have some time to cover those in detail and address them. During the presentation, attendee microphones will be muted and you will be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is being recorded and it will be archived and available on the IPDay website within 48 hours. So today's topic is pivot tables in Microsoft Excel. How can we use them? What are they good for? And what I'm going to kind of show you guys an introduction to setting up your first pivot table. Pivot tables are one of the most powerful tools in Excel for data analysis. They allow you to take a large amount of data and transform it into a useful summary report. The basic idea behind a pivot table is to provide a user-friendly interface for quickly looking through this data and summarizing it into rows and columns. For example, let's say that you have a large data set of student performance data for a program. You can use a pivot table to group the data by course, by school, or time period in order to gain insights into the performance of your students and the program. Pivot tables can also be used to create charts and graphs and to visualize your data in a more meaningful way. So today we're going to be grouping data, filtering data, and adding calculated fields to a pivot table. We are going to do it as a live demonstration. So I'm really eager to show you guys. I think it's going to be a very insightful presentation. So we'll now go to the live demonstration portion. All right, so many of you may be familiar with Microsoft Excel. You will need at least a little bit of basic understanding of how tables work and formulas in order to use your first pivot table. And before I get started on the steps to creating a pivot table, I do want to show you guys what one looks like so you can kind of get an idea. Basically, a pivot table summarizes data into rows and columns based on a table of raw data. Now, you can get your raw data from different sources. Many of you may export it from a student information system as a CSV or as an Excel file. And then once you open it in Microsoft Excel, you'll be able to manipulate it by adding formulas and, of course, turning that raw data into a pivot table. So here in front of you is a pivot table that takes some data from a raw data set that we are going to be using today. And I do want to add a quick disclaimer here. All of the data that you're going to be looking at today is fictitious student data. It is not real student data based on any actual individuals. So based on kind of the student performance data, it's been summarized to allow me to filter that data by program. And in this case, this is a summer school registration program that I've used, that I selected as a demo for this. So here you have the various summer school programs and some indicators that I had in the data. For example, did a student have device access? That was a yes or no question. That was very important. And did a student have internet access? That's also a yes or no question. So I've added those as filters to the data, and I've summarized it based on the total costs of registration and the summer school program. Now, if you look here on the left-hand side, you'll see that all the data was summarized by school and then by grade level and the grand total for each school. And all of this data was gathered and collected based on a table that had individual student records. And in my experience in education, this is something that you come across quite a bit when using student registration forms or when pulling raw data out of a student information system. And what you basically are doing is taking all of those numbers, calculating them, and putting them in a way where you can group them by school or by program or grade. So obviously very useful. I also have a second variation of this table that I did want to show you. And this one uses the built-in calculations within Microsoft Excel pivot tables to let me know how many students were registered for each grade level and in each school. So for example, here on the left-hand side, under the school option, we'll select the random school. Here we go, Bent Tree. And Bent Tree has a total of 23 students registered for summer school programs. And from those 23 students, 4 were in 9th grade, 1 was in 8th grade, 2 in 7th grade, 2 in 6th, 2 in 5th, and so on and so forth. So I do want to stress, this is what makes these pivot tables so useful, is that they do all the legwork of collecting that data and organizing it in a way in which you can add the formulas that you need to make the calculations that you need, right? So before we get started on creating our first pivot table, let's take a look at the data set that we are going to be using today. So this table, of course, is, as I said, fictitious student data, but it does have a couple columns. So let's kind of look through them so that we understand the data that we're working with. So the first two columns are the course cost and registration fee. I have a name, student ID number, student information here, school, grade level. I also have the summer school program, as well as some contact information for parents, some device access, the device access indicator rather, and the internet access indicator. Now, I did structure this mock set on a real form that we used for summer school, that I've used for summer school in my line of work. And the reason is that I wanted to give a realistic picture of how you can take what kind of looks like a messy table with a lot of individual records and use pivot tables to put it together and sort it into something that is easy to digest and send through email, or even share on Microsoft online, on Office 365 online. So the first thing that you're going to need to do in order to create your first pivot table is import this data. Now, something I do want to stress that's very important. When you are exporting this data, whether you're getting it from a student information system online or a local program, it's really important because many times when we export data, it comes out as a CSV file. And I know many of you are probably familiar with that. And a CSV file needs to be saved as an Excel once you've modified all this data into a pivot table, in order to be able to open that up later on and be able to pick up where you left off on the pivot table. So just want to make sure that I let you guys know that, because it's very important. When you do export that CSV and you do create your first pivot table, be sure not to save the file as a CSV, because it could create a lot of issues when you're trying to reopen that file later on. It's going to be ideal to save the file as an Excel. And that way, when you open it, your pivot table and your data set are basically ready to go. So without further ado, let's create our first pivot table here. So the first thing you want to do is select all the data that you're going to be including in the pivot table. So you don't have to include all the data from your table. As you notice here, I've hidden a couple columns which were not important, so I can start here in column E. You also do not need to include all the rows. If, for example, your first couple of entries are the only ones you want to include in that data, you can go ahead and do that. You can just create a pivot table from your first couple entries. And this is fairly important because pivot tables are adaptable. So you can always change the data source later. And if you create a pivot table that's linked to an actual Excel table like this one, you will be able to refresh the data every time that new entries are put in. And that saves you a lot of work, because that means that you don't need to go back into the table and recreate the entire pivot table from scratch. So what we're going to do here today is select our entire data set. And then we are going to go up here in the ribbon to the Insert tab, and we are going to click on the pivot table icon right here. And when you click on the pivot table icon, you will get a pop-up dialog box in which it will ask you if the range that you selected is the one that you want to create the pivot table from, and whether, how you want to open this pivot table. Do you want to create a new worksheet, or do you want to override the existing worksheet? I always click new worksheet. It just makes it a little bit easier. And voila, we have now taken all that data from our data set and put it in this kind of temporary holding place where we can access it now to build our pivot table. So some quick terminology before we start adding our fields. What you are looking at here on the right-hand side is called the field list. And the field list is essentially the kind of building window where you can arrange the various components of your pivot table. So if you right-click here on the pivot table window here where it says to build a report, choose fields from the pivot table field list, if you right-click there, you'll see hide field list and show field list. I always like to show this because although it's a little embarrassing to admit, when I first started using pivot tables, I remember losing the field list and not being able to find it. And so I do like to just let everybody know if your field list is missing, you just right-click here, click show field list, and that'll pop up right away here on the right-hand side. Okay. So the first pivot table that we're going to create today is to calculate how many students were in each, for a specific indicated summer school program, were registered by grade level in each of the schools. So if you were to look at the raw data set, it would be tremendously time consuming to add all of that up, even if you were to sort it and filter it. So what we are going to do is use a pivot table to make those calculations for us. So the first thing that we're going to do, since we want to sort everything by program, is add a filter here in the top left-hand corner to the filters box. We are going to drag the program filter. And what that does is it adds a little filter up here, you can see, with a drop-down arrow that allows you to select which program. And based on that selection, all the data for your pivot table will populate. So the next thing that we want to do is arrange our rows and our columns. So what I want to do is be able to see all the schools as my rows here. So I've moved school to row. Now, when you automatically check it, it'll default to the rows box, but you can alternatively just kind of drag it and it'll populate down here. And then across the top, what I want to do is have the grade levels so that I can see the counts by grade level. Perfect. So I've put all of my rows, I put all of my columns, but my data is not populating. And the reason for that is that once you have added your rows and your columns, you need to tell the pivot table what you want it to do at the intersection. And that is the final box down here, which is the values box. So what I want the pivot table to do is to count the total number of students that were registered for each of these schools for the indicated program and break that down by grade level. So I'm going to take this ID up here, the student ID, right? The student ID is an individual number for the entry. And I'm going to put that down here in values. Okay. And you'll notice that it defaulted to count of student ID. So what that means is that the pivot table is counting the total number of student IDs in each grade and by school. So if I go here to, let's say, Olympia Heights Elementary School, and I go to 10th grade, I have one student. That means there was one student that was registered for, in this case, all the programs for 10th grade. Now, I can add more slicers if I want to break down the information further. So, for example, if I need to know now how many students of the ones that were registered in a certain program also needed internet or device access, I could do that as well. I could add a device access filter to the top, and I could also add an internet access filter to the top. So now what I can do with this pivot table is a lot more than what I could do initially with the raw data set, because I have the ability to take all of these records, these hundreds of records, and summarize them. So let's kind of go through a specific instance. Let's say that for a specific program, in this case, we will select the, I don't know, let's select foreign language immersion. So we'll select foreign language immersion. It's kind of a low enrollment program. And then we'll do device access. So we need to know which students in this summer school program do not have device access. So in the entire, of all the selected schools in the entire summer program, I have two schools that have, one has a sixth grader and one has a ninth grader that do not have device access. So that lets me know that this school may need a laptop for that sixth grader, and this school may need a laptop for that ninth grader. And of course, we can very easily jump around between programs using our filter up here. So we can go to the summer reading camp, open that up. And let's say that we no longer need to know only who doesn't have a device, but also who doesn't have internet. So I'll click no. And what this will do is show me all the students that have no device, no internet with all the schools, and break it down by grade level. So here we have a few for 10th grade. We have one for 10th grade, one for 11th, one for 4th grade, and one for 8th grade. Oh, sorry, and one for 1st grade. So it's a total of 5 students across the program at 4 different schools that require both a device and internet access. So, really good way to summarize all of this data. And I'm going to reset this. And you can, of course, change the way that you use the filters and kind of move them around to experiment in a way that summarizes the data best for you. The whole purpose of these pivot tables is to take a really complicated data set and make it something that you can look at and use easily. So for our next pivot table variation, we're going to calculate, and we're going to go back to the one I showed you in the beginning of the presentation. We're going to calculate the total costs by school. So once again, we're going to go to our main table, and we're going to select all the data. We're going to go to Insert. We're going to select Pivot Table here. And then in the Pivot Table pop-up, we're going to make sure that we select New Worksheet and click OK. And here, we're going to use and introduce something called a calculated field. So although it's really great that the pivot tables can summarize all of this data, what really makes it even more fantastic is that you can create calculations, which can be very, very useful when you need to summarize the data and include or make an addition, subtraction, division, multiplication formula, or basically any formula that Excel has. So let's go ahead and take our school, and we're going to put that for rows, because we want to know the total number broken down by school, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to put the costs. So we're going to look for our cost columns. So we have a total course cost column, and we have a registration fee column. Sorry, I put those in the wrong place. I'm going to check these off. And what we're going to do is break it down by grade level, right? So we're going to take our grade level and put that in the columns, and now we have the total cost by column. So the next step is to create a calculated field. And a calculated field will basically do an Excel formula. So the formula that we want today is a simple addition formula. And what I want the pivot table to do is add the total cost from the total registration cost plus the registration fee. Now, those are two separate columns in our data set. And for this calculated field, it will combine them and put them together in one. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a calculated field. We're going to go to Field, Items, and Sets. So we are going to go here to Field, Items, and Sets. And what we're going to do is click on that and click on Calculated Field. Calculated field. So here, it's going to bring up the formula box and the field name. So we can call this total costs. And you'll notice that here in the bottom, in this little box where it says fields, are all your fields from your raw data. So this is where you can input this into the formula in order to get your calculation. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the total course cost. So we're going to double click on that, and you'll notice that it'll add it here to the formula. And very importantly, we're going to add a plus, right? Because we want to add that total course cost to the registration fee. So next, we're going to go to the registration fee field. We're going to double click on that. And we now have basically what we are telling Microsoft Excel to do is to create a column called total costs, in which the total cost, the total course cost, and the registration fee will be added together. So we're going to go ahead and click OK. All right, having a technical issue here. Let's try that again. Yes, forgot to click add. So we're going to do total cost. We're going to add the total cost plus the registration fee. We're going to add that, and we're going to click OK. Perfect. So don't forget to click that add button there in the top right hand corner. And once you go ahead and insert that, you'll notice that what it has done now is added a total cost field, which adds both of those cost fields, the registration fee and the total course cost, and breaks it down by grade level. So for each school in this summer school program, and in this case, it's all the summer school programs, it will break it down. So for 10th grade, for Ada Merit, K-8 Center, we have $100. That's the total number for that based on the enrollment. So the total number for this school would be 2,380, and that includes a sum of all of these broken down columns. Okay. So let's say that we have created this, we see the breakdown, and we realize that we need to break it down by program, because all of this is data that's summarized for the entirety of all the data. So we can still add a filter, and this is kind of the flexibility of the pivot table, is that you can add and remove fields and it won't affect anything that you've already put in. So you're going to go ahead and look for the program. So let's look for the program, and we're going to drag that to the filters. So once we drag that to the filters, you can see on the top left-hand corner that there's a box that says program with a drop-down menu. And I can now select from any of these programs to filter the cost by program. You also notice that in this drop-down menu, there's a small checkbox at the bottom that indicates whether or not you can select multiple items. This is particularly useful if you need to group things within a filter. So if you want the total number for a few programs instead of only one, you would check that off. So for example, if you want all of the data for only, let's say, we'll do this one, middle school course recovery, and we have a couple here, I'll click that, and it'll give me only the 6 through 8 schoolhouse model, which is a specific program. But if I need data from another program in addition to this program, I would have to select this multiple items checkbox. And then I can select as many as I need. So I'm going to want this middle school course recovery as well as the other course recovery program. And you'll notice now it includes both sets of data, right? And up here where it says program, it includes multiple items. And you can add as many as you need to. So we'll default this back to all. So I do want to go back to our original pivot table here that has our summarized data. So just to kind of recap, when you are modifying things, there's a couple things to remember. Your rows are always going to be the data indicated here in the A column, in the first column, and your columns data is always going to come across the top. It's important that you not forget to put a value, because without a value, the pivot table will not know what you want it to do with that organization structure. So that is a really important part. And the next thing I want to cover is refreshing data. So let's go back to our data set. And let's say that we want to add some data. We need to, or change some data. Let's change some data. Let's say that we are now changing our registration fee for our summer school programs from the $15 to, let's say we're discounting it. We're going to discount it to help students and families, right? So we're going to change that to $10. I'm going to use a couple little tricks here to make this quicker, but I'll change this to $10 across the whole set. So you see there, our registration cost before was $15 for every course. Now it is only 10. So if we go back to our Excel sheet, our pivot table, you'll notice that the costs haven't changed. The costs have not changed. And the reason is that the pivot table is not a live refreshing piece of Excel. You have to tell it to refresh so that it can go back to the table, grab the new data, and change the data here in the pivot table. So the way that you do that is right-clicking in the middle of your pivot table and clicking on the refresh icon that you see right here. It's like a page with a bent corner and the refresh icon on it. You're going to click that, and you'll notice that all my numbers have changed now. So what it has done, it has recalculated all the formulas in the calculated field that we added, and it has taken the numbers from our new numbers that we put in the data set. So that concludes the live portion of today's demo on pivot tables. Feel free to experiment. Pivot tables are incredibly useful for a number of different types of data, and you don't have to only use one column or one row. There are other more complex ways to break this apart. I just wanted to show you guys how to start your very first one and how to access, how to take these raw tables and turn them into reports that are a little bit easier to digest. At this time, I do want to take a moment to look through the questions and kind of see if there are any that, let's open up here, the questions. Here we go. So once again, I'm going to have a few minutes here for questions. If you feel like there was anything that you wanted me to explain in a little more detail, please feel free to ask it in the Q&A option. So please go ahead and do that in the Q&A option. And I'll wait just a few seconds to see if anybody has any questions. I hope that you guys have a better working understanding of how to use a pivot table. I know that it can be a little daunting at times because Excel can seem a little bit complex, but ultimately these tools are gonna simplify the way that you look at data. So I always really encourage educators to really take a deep dive into their data, their student performance data, their school performance data. And it doesn't look like we have any questions, so that is a good thing. At this time, I'm going to move on to the feedback. Please take a moment to give us a little bit of feedback on today's Tech Tuesday webinar. We really do appreciate this feedback. It lets us know how we can modify or create new content for you guys, and it gives us a kind of guide. At this time, I also want to take a moment to promote tomorrow's webinar Wednesday. That's tomorrow, Wednesday, March 8th. And the webinar is titled Presenting IET Programs to Your ESOL and ABE Students. And it's going to be at 3 o'clock tomorrow, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So be sure to register and tune in. These are great webinars. They provide some incredible resources for educators to apply in their classrooms. So be sure to register and tune in. I know I'll be there, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Thank you.